I taught history at UNC for over 40 years and retired in 2007. And when the pandemic began in March, when I thought of my colleagues doing virtual teaching, I was so relieved that I was retired. Wondered how anybody could teach online. I wanted talking to the void without seeing their listeners and responding to their reactions. And now I'm about to find out. When I agreed to give this talk a year ago, as a sequel to Harry Watson's presentation on Chapel Hill before the chapel, my thought was to begin by asking my audience for a show of hands. How many had joined the parish since 2010, 2000, 1990, and so on? Mostly in order to drive home at the beginning the fact that so much of today's parish has only been here for a quarter of a century at most, and partly to reassure myself that what I was going to be saying would probably be new to most people. I'm going to be talking about the parish in the 1960s and our rector then, Tom Thrasher. As a historian, I know how hard it is to understand a time and place you don't know, because we keep imposing our own present-day expectations on the past and thinking we can judge it by modern standards. We're seeing a lot of that today. I thought of this when, after Harry talked about Chapel Hill 160 years ago, he was immediately asked concrete questions about what it was like then, the population, construction techniques of houses, and things like that. Well, I want to make you understand what this town was like, how different it was only 60 years ago. So before I talk about Tom, I'm going to talk about the Chapel Hill my wife Julie and I found when we came here in 1964. I was to join the history department at UNC and didn't even have my PhD yet. We drove down from New Jersey, Princeton, and came in through the divided highway that had just opened from Durham 8 months before. Cut through the raw pine forest, no traffic lights yet, no traffic, no businesses. And then we went up 2 lanes into Chapel Hill and Franklin Street. It reminded us a lot of Princeton. One small street through town, diagonal parking, a post office, 3 department stores, including a Belk's, 3 drugstores, 2 hardware stores, 2 men's clothing stores, a splendid bookstore, the Intimate Bookshop, and a wonderful grocery store, Fowler's, where you could buy on credit, and I don't mean a credit card, I kept a tab, and have your purchases delivered to you for a quarter. There was just 1 restaurant on Franklin Street, believe it or not, and no t-shirt stores anywhere in sight. To the left, the front campus, exactly as it looks today, but the rear one less so. There was no Hamilton Hall, no business school, no Pitt or student stores or union, no Davis Library. Instead, a concrete baseball stadium and some temporary pre-flight buildings left over from World War II. Over South Road, there was a much smaller Keenan Stadium, but of course, no Dean Dome, no Carmichael dorms. We played our basketball that year in a structure affectionately called the Tin Can. I was teaching freshman Civ that fall, and in November, a student came up to me after class and asked, or said, Coach Smith gives us all, I'm on the basketball team, and Coach Smith gives us all tickets to give away if we have anybody that wants them. I've got 2 tickets, and I can't find anybody that wants to go to the game. So he offered them to us, we took them, and it converted us. But that's the way it was. It was not quite the basketball fanaticism that there is today. If you pushed on further past South Road and beyond the bell tower, there was a single building that was the medical school and hospital combined. It had been opened in 1962. Beyond that, nothing but dairy farms. There were no malls. The big area that dominated now by Harris Teeter and Silver Spot That was an enormous empty field where people went to fly their kites. It was for sale, $500 an acre, but nobody was interested. In 1964, Chapel Hill was a small, comparatively isolated southern university town with relatively limited resources that happened to house undoubtedly the best school in the Southeast. Let me expand a little on these adjectives. University town. The university was the only employer. There was no industry. The research triangle was a recent vision, but nothing more than a vision until IBM decided to invest in it in, I think, 1965. It was a total company town. The university owned and ran the water system, the sewer system, the telephone company. Paternalistically, it provided housing for young faculty. We paid $47 a month for our first 2 years for a house a block from the Carolina Inn. Small. The Chapel Hill population in the 1960 census was 12,000, 9,000 in 1950, but it was beginning to see the baby boom. It was only slightly bigger in 1964, and it called itself still a village with some reason. In my first year, there might have been 11,000 students in the university if you counted the professional schools and if you counted summer school. Last year there were 30,000. There was a freshman class of 2,000. This year it was 5. Isolated. Well, you could drive by the new 2-lane highway. You could fly in. Raleigh-Durham RDU existed, but you reached it, and Raleigh behind it, by a 2-lane road. You could park in front of its single building if you were meeting someone, and even walk out onto the field to greet them. Finally, Southern. You can't realize how important and deeply rooted Southern identity was then and how much of a divide there was in the US. The North still thought of the South as benighted, rural, and backward. It was the Bible Belt with hookworm, a view really left over from the Depression. When I told my mother, who was brought up on Maryland's eastern shore, where I was going to teach, she commanded me, never go outdoors barefoot. But the culture was different. A few random examples for you. A majority of my history department had degrees from Southern universities. Southern and North Carolina history courses were by far the most common and most popular. I always wondered whether my Princeton degree had been an experiment. We didn't feel we needed air conditioning. We just started the semester at the end of September. No women were admitted to UNC in the first 2 years. They went to UNCG instead, Greensboro, and transferred as juniors. Really a different world. Now, of course, for decades there's been in-migration from the north, workers looking to a newly industrialized south, retirees looking for warmth, culture, retirement communities, so that old identity is now terribly diluted, a shadow of what it once was. On that first ride up into Chapel Hill, we would have seen the 4 churches on Franklin Street, and I think had been most impressed by the First Baptist Church at the Central Crossroads, right next to Chapel Hill High, that sprawled over the Target complex that you now see there instead. The Chapel of the Cross was probably the smallest of the 4. Our present grandiose parish hall, of course, didn't exist then. A gravel parking lot filled most of that space. It had about 200 individuals on the rolls. Far fewer than that came to church on Sunday. And it was staffed only by a rector and by the Episcopal chaplain. I'll have some more to say about the chaplaincy in a minute. It was not only small, it was a poor parish. The every member canvass brought in about $50,000 a year, of which the vestry was pledged to spend no more than half on the parish itself. Half its income was committed to missions in Panama and Uganda. Like everything else in Chapel Hill, the church was dominated by the university. The vestry in 1964 included professors of zoology, Spanish, English, business, and the rare book librarian. This was the church Thomas Thrasher had found when he accepted its invitation to replace our former priest David Yates, who had left to go to Sewanee. Tom arrived in Chapel Hill in early February 1960. He had been born in Mississippi in 1909 and grew up in Tennessee and Alabama. He graduated from the University of Tennessee, took a divinity degree from Sewanee in 1934, and was ordained priest that same year. He had positions as assistant and then rector in Tennessee parishes until 1942, when he was called north to Indianapolis to become rector of its Church of the Advent. He admitted later that he felt terribly homesick there as an expatriate Southerner. Then in 1947, he was called back to the South to become rector of the Church of the Ascension in Montgomery, Alabama, the biggest Episcopal church in that city, with a marvelous neo-Gothic building. Here he soon became extremely popular, and when he was given a tempting offer from St. Paul's, Alexandria in Virginia, the congregation in Montgomery circulated petitions that in the end convinced him to stay with them in Alabama. He was back home. And yet coming back from Indiana to the South had awakened in him a painful consciousness of the inherent condescension and prejudice towards blacks that he and other Southern whites displayed. It was an attitude he had never recognized before, much less questioned. And now he began to try to confront it in a variety of ways, looking to bring about communication and conciliation between the races. The Montgomery of the 1950s gave him plenty of chances to do so. He joined the local Council on Human Relations, the only integrated group in Montgomery, becoming its president. And when the Montgomery bus boycott began after Rosa Parks' arrest in December 1955, it was Tom who tried to act as an intermediary between the city's white and black leadership. This visible engagement with race relations and his increasingly pointed sermons on the brotherhood of man caused a large portion of his congregation, which included not only the mayor, but a number of the city's more prominent segregationists, to turn more and more openly against him. Then in 1959, he admitted a black Episcopal priest to communion at the early service on June 28th. His outraged vestry passed a resolution that it was clearly and unequivocally their policy that a segregated congregation is in the best interest of our church, and guards were hired to see that no more blacks attended the Eucharist there. Under these attacks, Tom wrote despairingly to his bishop, Charles Carpenter, for support. At first professing his support, Carpenter soon backed away from Tom and encouraged him to resign as rector of the Church of the Ascension and to look for a position somewhere else. By February 1960, Tom had left Montgomery for Chapel Hill, where he had been appointed rector of the Chapel of the Cross. I dare say he must have been looking forward to a new beginning here. Something that would have been very much on his mind at that moment were social issues and race relations in his new home. He must have known before deciding to come here that his predecessor, David Yates, had already seen to it in 1955 that the church would welcome both black and white communicants. It was in that same year that UNC had admitted its first black students. Chapel Hill wasn't Montgomery, but many of the village's public accommodations were segregated. Fatefully, Tom came to town at exactly the moment when protests and sit-ins were beginning in Chapel Hill, inspired by the Greensboro sit-ins that had begun 3 weeks before, February 1st, 3 weeks before Tom arrived in North Carolina. The first Chapel Hill sit-in was the action of 9 students from Lincoln High School, the black high school on Merritt Mill Road. Chapel Hill High downtown, which I mentioned, was white. They could drink cherry Cokes at the lunch counter, but not sit in booths at the Colonial Drugstore on West Franklin Street, which is now, I think, called the West End Wine Bar, and it's another mark of how the town has changed. A plaque was put up there this year on the 60th anniversary of the event, which occurred just 4 days after Tom arrived in town. That was only the beginning of a series of local protests. Sit-ins and picketing were organized at lunch counters, then at the Carolina Movie Theater. The battle over the movie theaters was won in February 1962, and other businesses gradually desegregated, but there were still many holdouts. Picketing and sit-ins continued through 1963 with a big multiracial pro-integration march down Franklin Street in late May, but the aldermen voted no, 4-2, in June on an ordinance on ending segregation in businesses in town. By this time, there were still perhaps 20 or 25 segregated businesses here, as the Daily Tar Heel reported. 9 barbershops, 6 or 8 eating places, 3 motels, and others. There was mass civil disobedience at the Merchants Association in June of 1963. More violent exchanges at 2 restaurants, Brady's on East Franklin Street, roughly where Dunkin' Donuts is now, and the Rock Pile, roughly at the corner of East Franklin and Estes, and also at Watts Motel and Restaurant south of town, across from Southern Village today. In January 1964, it became more than a local issue when James Farmer of the Congress on Racial Equality came to Chapel Hill the day before the aldermen were to vote on an integration ordinance again, and gave a very public ultimatum to them. Not surprisingly, they resented threats from outside and again voted no. So under the leadership of CORE, there were massive demonstrations in February, building up during the spring, with at least a dozen other national civil rights leaders coming to town. 1,000 protesters were put on trial for trespass by a very unsympathetic judge in Hillsborough. And then, abruptly, the National Civil Rights Act of July 2nd, 1964, made it all moot. The 24 segregated businesses I mentioned all accepted the situation, not always graciously. Integration of the high schools followed and meant that Lincoln High had to be closed after the 1965-66 year. You might say that that entailed loss as well as gain. Lincoln High had won the state football championship in 1961, scoring 40 points a game and not giving up a single point all season, and now it didn't exist anymore. It's hard now to believe, but when I started teaching here at the end of September 1964, I had no idea what had been going on here. There was absolutely no obvious sign to a young newcomer like me that segregation had ever been a part of life here. As far as I can tell from the vestry minutes, which are virtually our only parish records from the period, the parish collectively seems not to have reacted actively to the demonstrations one way or another. It was much more preoccupied with somehow finding money in its poverty for urgently needed repairs to the church fabric, and with a continuing series of burglaries from the church buildings, furniture, typewriters, brass candlesticks, and even a flag. Tom seems to have had no active role in supporting the sit-ins and demonstrations. Conciliation and communication came much more naturally to him and had been his chosen avenue of expression in Montgomery. Probably for that reason, he was soon selected to head the Chapel Hill Carrboro Ministers Association and was its spokesman in letters to the Chapel Hill newspaper. Yes, we had a good local newspaper in those days. I've heard a story that the African American community initially mistrusted what seemed to be Tom's lack of concern with the institution of segregation, before Martin Luther King visited Chapel Hill in May 1960 and told them about Tom's personal history in Montgomery, which Tom himself never spoke of. The minutes do show that he wrote to the mayor of Chapel Hill in May 1964 in the name of the vestry to put the church on record just as the protesters were going to trial in Hillsborough. We favor the use of persuasion, the power of example, and the marshaling of public opinion in the interests of a united, just, and desegregated community. Sounds very much like the Tom Thrasher of 1950s Montgomery. Tom chose that same moment finally to go on record as an individual. After being forced out of Montgomery, he had been asked to contribute a chapter to a book of essays on the Episcopal Church in these times of social activity, called On the Battle Lines. And he had spent what time he could in his first years in Chapel Hill on an essay that was a kind of deeply felt mea culpa, describing how, an unthinking Southerner, he had come to reject the attitudes he had grown up with and to believe in the need to recognize and enshrine the equality of the races. The book came out in 1963, and Tom arranged for a full page of the Chapel Hill newspaper to publish the majority of that soul-searching autobiographical essay right when the village demonstrations were climaxing. It's in the newspaper of May 17, 1964. I can't do justice to it here, but there's a copy of the entire chapter in the loose-leaf binder containing the biographies of our rectors, just outside the rector's office, and the book itself is in the parish library. I really hope that at least of you will seek it out and read this heartfelt, terribly moving, utterly candid statement, which I think was one more attempt at encouraging mediation and understanding. But I ought to make it clear that Tom was far from discouraging activism in his parish. Clarence Parker was an Episcopal priest who had spent all his life committed to social justice. He supported the Southern Conference Educational Fund, the North Carolina Council on Human Relations, the American Friends Service Committee, the ACLU, the National Council of American Soviet Fellowship, and the CIO, among other organizations. And when he retired to Chapel Hill, he joined the parish and became what today we would call a priest associate, taking occasional services, preaching, and speaking to parishioners. In May 1963, Father Parker took a leading role in organizing a group to coordinate the Chapel Hill protests. He turned 80 that year, and over the next months he was present at pickets and sit-ins and marches, often hauled bodily away by the police. But there's no sign that that perturbed Tom in the least. He continued to involve Father Parker in parish work, making sure that he was integrated and a visible participant in parish life. One more vignette from a slightly later moment. The demonstrations had been noisy enough to help convince the North Carolina legislature that radical agitators were infiltrating Chapel Hill. And in 1963, it enacted a law that prohibited communists from speaking on campus, the famous speaker ban law. It attracted national attention and scorn, internal resistance from the university, and students did what they could to ridicule it. For example, inviting the well-known Marxist historian Herbert Aptheker to speak in Chapel Hill in March 1966. There's a famous photograph that shows Aptheker standing on a Franklin Street sidewalk with masses of students standing on the campus side of a stone wall around the campus listening to him speak. But Tom had done something similar the year before with much less publicity. When the NAACP had invited Carl Braden to speak at UNC on dismantling segregation in the spring of 1965, Braden was a prominent Southern activist and field director for the Southern Conference Education Fund. The university moved quickly to deny him access to campus because the fund's parent organization had been founded in part by communists. So the NAACP arranged for Braden to speak at the Chapel of the Cross. It's only Tom who could have taken the initiative in setting it up. The law, I should say, was declared unconstitutional in 1968, but it had been proven largely unenforceable. As I look back on these days, there are two other things I think commanded Tom's attention during his decade here. He believed strongly, much more than David Yates had, in the power of liturgy. Believed that understanding that the history and structure and form of a service enhanced its meaning for the participant. Up through the 1950s, our Sunday leaflet had just contained news items. But in the first Sunday after Tom arrived here, in February 1960, it listed the order of service in the Book of Common Prayer, the scriptural readings, and the anthem, just as we now take to be the norm. In December, he made another unheard of innovation, scheduling a service of carols and the Eucharist at 11 p.m. on Christmas Eve. Previously, the last service of that day had been at 7. It's another of his innovations that has become tradition. Part of this belief in the power of form found expression in his enthusiastic support of church music. The church had always had a volunteer choir, typically directed part-time by a music student from the university who tended to resign when studies became too demanding. The organist who accompanied hymns was also a student volunteer from the parish, Joe Farrell, who finished his undergraduate degree at UNC the year Tom arrived and was working towards a law degree for the next 3 years. Tom wanted music to have permanence and continuity in our life, and in 1962, he was the force behind something new, a national search, not local, not even southern regional, a national search for a full-time organist choir master. The applications came to him, and he and the vestry eventually selected Jerry Baab, B-A-A-B, a German name, a young product of Union Theological Seminary's School of Sacred Music, who had had outstanding teachers there. Jerry's contract was supposed to be reconsidered every year, but from the beginning there was never any question that he might be discharged. He immediately began to transform the musical side of our church life, and Tom was delighted. Jerry arrived in September 1963, and from then on, the Sunday bulletins began to list organ preludes and postludes. In December 1963 came another innovation, an Advent evensong that included a performance of Bach's Cantata 140, Wacht auf. He had organized a small orchestra from members of the community and found soloists to complement the parish choir. Wayne Czar, tenor and conductor of the university chorus, and Bernice Otedeco, a wonderful soprano who was a graduate student in UNC's School of Public Health and still comes back regularly from California to attend the university's Black Alumni Reunion. There had been nothing like that here before, but from then on, special services or concerts were part of our parish life. The parish choir that Jerry found here was really small, and for the next year or so, he had to build it up. Tom helped with appeals in the bulletin and by occasional buttonholing of passersby. Right after our arrival here in September 1964, Julie was admitted to Memorial Hospital, registered as an Episcopalian. Tom saw it, and when he found we had sung in the Princeton choir, he encouraged us to come into church and perhaps sing, as we did for the next 30 years plus. At first, that choir was tiny. A Sunday choir might have 8, 2 on a part, singing for a congregation of perhaps 50. We remember one Sunday early when it was literally SATB. The two of us and John and Barbara Schnorenberg. John was a young art historian at UNC. Remember, it was very much, largely, a university church then. Jerry, on his part, was eager to profit from the university. He entered the doctoral program in music and edited the work of the 17th century composer Caspar Förster for his PhD. He brought with him a taste for early music that very soon attracted outside people to the choir and so to the church. For example, students and faculty from the music department, because routinely we were performing pieces by composers not at all common in the South then. Gibbons and Bird perhaps on Sunday, or working on bigger pieces like Lobet and Hern, or the Lamentations of Jeremiah, or the Mozart Vespers. That was Bernice Otedeco again. I remember we offered the midnight mass of Charpentier in our first winter with the choir in the evening, after which Tom gleefully brought out a bottle of champagne for us to share. I should add that Chapel Hill still didn't permit restaurants to serve liquor by the drink then. So was Jerry Bob's enthusiasm and ability and interest, vigorously supported by Tom Thrasher, that supported and shaped the not inconsiderable, quite sophisticated musical program that Van Quinn found solidly in place for him when he arrived in 1970. Jerry had by then taken his PhD and gone to Germany to direct a choir in Berlin, where he still lives in retirement. In another respect, however, Tom found it impossible to shape his new parish as he had hoped. Another dream was never realized. He had come here clearly supposing that the church's historic connection with the university would allow him to create and work with a community of Episcopal students. The difficulty he encountered was that it was the Diocese of North Carolina that appointed and paid the chaplain to the university, whose responsibilities to the parish weren't at all well defined. A new chaplain happened to be appointed shortly after Tom's arrival here. He was given office space in the tiniest parish house, and during the next several years there were recurring disagreements over whether the chaplain could be called on by the rector for parochial duties, and to what extent, and to how far he should consult with the rector in his dealings with the university students. The chaplain obviously felt that he was an independent agent. That chaplain resigned in 1964 to take up a parish in Georgia, and the potential difficulties inherent in the relationship had become obvious enough that the bishop left the position of Episcopal chaplain vacant for 2 years while the student body continued to grow. 11,000 students on campus in 64, over 13,000 in 66. During those 2 years, Tom was the senior of just 2 Episcopal priests in Chapel Hill. Holy Family had been started as a mission in 1950. And it put a strain on his health, which was already visibly declining. The vestry talked of searching for an associate rector, but we were a poor parish and there was no money for it. The staff was Tom, a part-time secretary and part-time director of Christian education, both chosen from the congregation, and the organist choir master. That was all. At the end of 1966, the bishop finally appointed not 1, but 2 Episcopal chaplains to the university. But the problem of responsibilities wasn't confronted, and the chaplain's desire for independence persisted. So 2 years later, the bishop suddenly declared, to the astonishment of the chaplain with cross vestry, that the 2 positions would both be terminated, and the chaplains were reassigned elsewhere as of June 1969. Though by that fall, there were 18,000 students in the university. A new chaplain hadn't yet been selected when Tom resigned in the spring of 1970 for reasons of ill health. He died in January 1971. His hopes for the growth of a closer relationship between the parish and Episcopal students at the university had been disappointed by the circumstances. I think the university did well when it chose Tom as rector 10 years before and brought him to this small, isolated southern university town. He understood the South, it was a part of it, but he recognized an overriding need for it to change, and he did his part in helping it change, carrying his congregation with him. He was comfortable with a small community where his vision of personal ministry was practical. He felt a need as rector to make personal calls upon every member of his parish at their home so that he could talk with them and understand their individual concerns. And he embraced the presence of the university, imagining it as a kind of non-canonical extension of the parish, with his vestry and choir and congregation, all in large part drawn from that community next door and drawing from its strengths. Tom died as town and university and church were on the verge of rapid change, all 3 about to grow almost unimaginably in size and wealth, with all the different problems and opportunities that has brought. For better or worse, our little local world has become very different from what it was only 60 years ago.